Some mysteries, they just kind of get under your skin, stick with you.
Mm.
And the Hinterkaifeck murders back in 1922, well, that's one of those cases for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a chilling one.
We got that Unsolved episode, and wow, talk about a wild ride. 6 people murdered on this isolated farm in Bavaria. And then the killer, they just hang out there for days afterwards. It's crazy.
Yeah, the fact that the killer stayed at the farm is one of the things that makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing, right?
Totally. So I guess the big question is why? Why has this case just captivated people for over a century? What is it about this one?
Well, I think a big part of it is just the sheer brutality of the crime. I mean, 6 people, an entire family and their maid, and then, the isolation of Hinterkaifeck. This wasn't just any farm,
Right. It was like its own little world out there.
Exactly. Picture this. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, they were the older couple. And then their widowed daughter, Victoria, her 2 kids, little Cecilia, she was 7, and Joseph, just 2 years old. And then Maria Baumgartner, the maid. That was it. That was their whole world. And so that isolation, it really just adds this layer of eeriness to the whole thing.
Totally. And then you add in those premonitions, those creepy events leading up to it all, and it's like, whoa.
Right. The Unsolved episode really dove into those, and for good reason.
Like footprints in the snow.
Yeah.
But they only led to the farm, not away. And then house keys vanished. And get this, the maid before Maria, she quit because she swore the place was haunted.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
Right. It makes you wonder, were these actual premonitions? Or were they early signs that someone was already messing with the family?
Yeah, I mean, could those events have been meant to scare the family? Or was it someone, just watching them, observing them, figuring out their routines?
Oh, that's creepy.
It is. And think about this, Andreas. He even told people he heard footsteps in the attic. But when he went to check, there was no one there. Can you imagine?
That would freak me out for sure.
Yeah, it's that feeling that something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it.
Definitely sets a spooky scene for what's to come.
Exactly. So then days go by, nobody sees the Grubers, no one hears from them. The neighbors start to get worried, which is understandable, right?
Totally.
Yep.
I mean, this is a small, tight-knit community.
Yeah. So finally, some of the neighbors decided, all right, we got to go check on them. And that's when they found, a scene straight out of a nightmare.
Oh, man, it's just awful.
In the barn, they found 4 bodies. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia, all brutally murdered.
And later, they found Maria and little Joseph dead inside the house, too. Just horrific.
It's just devastating. And the murder weapon. It was a mattock, a farm tool.
Every time I hear about the mattock, I don't know. It's such a personal, violent way to kill someone.
Yeah, it's not a quick or painless death.
And to do that to, multiple people, it suggests a level of rage, like something much deeper was going on.
Absolutely. And then there's the fact that the killer didn't just run away. They stayed at the farm for days after the murder.
I know, it's so creepy.
Fed the cattle, ate the family's food, even lit fires. Imagine being surrounded by the people you just killed and just going about your day.
That's chilling.
Yeah, it's a level of detachment that's really hard to comprehend. And then to make things even more complicated, the Unsolved episode talked about how the neighbors, they went into the house before the police got there.
Oh, yeah. I remember thinking, uh-oh. That's probably not a good thing for the investigation.
Right. Unfortunately, forensic science was still pretty new back in 1922. I mean, today we have DNA evidence, all sorts of high-tech stuff. But back then, the neighbors going in probably contaminated the crime scene.
Yeah, they didn't know they were messing things up. They were just trying to help.
Exactly. So that definitely made Inspector Rian Gruber's job way harder.
Which makes it even more amazing that they were still able to piece together certain details. Like the fact that little Cecilia might have actually survived for hours after the attack.
Oh, that just breaks my heart.
I know. And she was found clutching tufts of her own hair. She probably pulled it out in terror. And to think that she might have even witnessed the murders.
Yeah, that's one of the most haunting aspects of this whole case. It adds this whole other level of tragedy to an already horrific event.
Totally. And then it makes you think, why? Why target the children? Was it to eliminate witnesses? Or was there something else going on, something even darker?
It's a question that's haunted investigators for years. And then, you combine that with the killer staying at the farm for days, and it really points to the idea that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was calculated, personal, planned.
Yeah, this wasn't some, robbery gone wrong.
Exactly. And that brings us to the suspects. the Unsolved episode laid out some pretty compelling possibilities.
Yeah, the suspects. Okay, let's dive into that.
All right, so let's start with Carl Gabriel. He was Victoria's estranged husband.
Right.
Officially declared dead in World War I.
Right.
But there are all these rumors that he might have actually survived.
Okay, yeah, so like what if he comes back to Hinterkaifeck and finds Victoria, with another man and their child?
Exactly. Classic revenge story, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, but wouldn't a vengeful husband, leave some kind of trace? I mean, the Unsolved episode made a big deal about how there's zero physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem with pointing the finger at Carl. No witnesses, no belongings found at the farm.
Right.
But here's something to consider. If he was presumed dead, he might have been living under a new name. That would make him pretty hard to track.
True, and back then it wasn't like everyone had passports and,
Exactly. Travel records weren't exactly what they are today.
Right, so it's like he's a ghost.
Great.
Which, given all that stuff about the farm being haunted, kind of adds to the whole creep factor.
For sure. But let's say, for argument's sake, it wasn't Carl. Who else had a motive?
Well, the Unsolved episode brought up Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Yeah.
He was the neighbor, right? And he was also the father of Victoria's son, Joseph.
Exactly. Talk about complicated family dynamics.
Yeah, no kidding.
And we know he was familiar with the layout of the farm, which actually lines up with what the AI analysis suggested.
Well, hold on. Back up a sec. The AI analysis, we kind of skipped over that whole thing.
Oh, right.
How does AI even play into, a 100-year-old cold case?
It's a pretty new approach, but it's fascinating. Think of AI like a super detective. It can process tons of information. Witness statements, crime scene photos, old records, anything you can digitize.
Wow.
And it looks for patterns, connections, things that maybe human investigators missed.
So for Hinterkaifeck, what did the AI focus on?
Well, first of all, the killings. They were very methodical. And the killer stayed at the farm for days, remember? They knew their way around. They even closed the barn door after the murders, like they didn't want to be found right away.
Ugh, that's creepy.
Yeah. And then there's the brutality of the attack, especially how little Cecilia was killed.
Yeah, that was just awful.
The AI saw that level of violence as coming from a really personal place, like a grudge or a need for revenge.
Okay, so not just some random act, but something planned out. Driven by some serious emotion.
Mm-hmm.
But doesn't that apply to, both suspects?
It could. But there's one more detail from the AI analysis that we haven't talked about yet.
Okay, what's that?
The family's cow was also killed. And in the exact same way as the human victims.
Seriously, was the cow a witness or something?
No, not quite. But it does tell us that the killer knew how to handle livestock. Someone who could approach a large animal and,
Right. Someone comfortable around farm animals.
Exactly. And that detail actually points more towards Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Right, because he was a farmer himself.
Exactly. He would have known how to do that. So the AI is basically connecting these seemingly random details to create a possible profile.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And also kind of scary if you think about it.
It is. And it brings us back to Lorenz's behavior after the bodies were found. He used a key to unlock the house. He went in alone.
Okay. That's a little suspicious.
Right. It seemed helpful at the time, but you could also see it as trying to control things, maybe even messing with the crime scene.
Yeah, like he was trying to cover his tracks?
Possibly. So we have a suspect who fits the AI profile. He had a possible motive, and he acted a little shady at the crime scene.
That sounds pretty bad for Lorenz. Is that enough to say he definitely did it?
Well, that's where the limits of AI come in.
Ah.
It can do amazing things, analyze data, spot patterns, make predictions, but it can't actually prove someone's guilty.
Right.
That still takes hard evidence, and that's what's missing in the Hinterkaifeck case. Despite all the investigating, they never found that smoking gun.
So even with all this technology, we're basically in the same boat as those investigators 100 years ago.
Pretty much, yeah. It's frustrating, isn't it?
It is frustrating. It's like we have the suspects, and the motives seem to make sense, but we just don't have that final piece, It makes you wonder if we're missing something obvious, some tiny little detail that would just make everything click into place.
That's what's so intriguing about cold cases, right? They often depend on these tiny little things that might have seemed totally unimportant at the time. And that's where revisiting these cases with a fresh perspective, maybe using something like AI, can be so helpful.
Right, like those footprints, remember? The ones leading to the farm, but not away. In the Unsolved episode, they said Andreas found those just a few days before the murders. What if those weren't just some random person passing by? What if it was the killer? checking out the place, seeing what the family's routine was like.
It's a good point. And it definitely supports the idea that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was planned out. And then you have those missing house keys, too. Was it the killer who took them? Or was someone in the family involved somehow?
Ugh, wow, that's a creepy thought. The Unsolved episode didn't really go into that possibility. But imagine if one of the victims was somehow in on it. Maybe even planned the whole thing.
It's a dark possibility, but we can't rule it out completely. And this is where another part of the Hinterkaifeck case gets even more disturbing, and that's the incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria.
Yeah, that was a huge bombshell in the Unsolved episode. It really throws a wrench into the whole family dynamic.
Think about the secrets and the resentment that must have been simmering beneath the surface in that family. Could that have played a role in the murders? Was it the motive itself? Or did it just create a situation where someone else could take advantage of them?
Makes you wonder if other people knew about the incest too, right? People outside the family who might have had a reason to want them all quiet.
Exactly. The problem is, the AI can only work with the information it has. If there were secret motives or relationships that no one ever wrote down, they're invisible, even to the most advanced algorithms.
So even with AI, we're stuck with what we know. It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing. What about the other half? Could there be information out there that we just haven't found yet?
It's always possible. Lost diaries, letters. Maybe someone confessed on their deathbed and it was never recorded. And with how much DNA technology has improved, maybe someday we'll be able to get usable samples from the crime scene that they couldn't analyze back then.
That would be amazing. Imagine finally getting real answers after all this time. But even if that never happens, the Hinterkaifeck murders still give us something, They give us this glimpse into how complicated and dark human nature can be. It makes you think about family, secrets, and how violence can be hidden just beneath the surface of everyday life.
I agree completely. And it's a reminder that searching for the truth is a process. We might never have all the answers, but that doesn't mean we should stop asking questions, looking at different possibilities, and challenging what we think we know. Who knows? Maybe someday the whole story of Hinterkaifeck will finally come out. But until then, the mystery lives on. It's a story that captures our imaginations and reminds us of the power of the unknown.
It's definitely been a fascinating deep dive. This case is a chilling reminder that some stories never really end, they just keep going in our minds. Thanks for joining me today. This is definitely a case that'll stick with me for a while.